Chapter 8. The Bridge and the Blade. The war table was ringed with maps. Not parchment maps, these were etched into thick slabs of wood, the lines burned deep, the rivers inlaid with thin strips of silver, the mountains carved in such fine relief that Juliet could trace each ridge with her fingertip. Around it, the air felt heavy with damp wool and the faint, metallic tang of sharpening stones. Lucien stood at the head of the table, braced on his forearms, listening intently as the Wolfkin scouts recounted the raid in low, rapid Therion. Dravik lounged at the far end, his armor still dented from the border fight, his expression an unspoken, knowing I told you so. Catherine sat to one side, his feathered cloak arranged with the casual precision of someone who wanted to appear bored but miss nothing. Juliet stayed near rear at the wall, a quiet shadow, close enough to hear but far enough not to invite comment at least, that was the hope. The Hawks will not send warriors to guard your northern flank, Catherine said smoothly, running one claw along the edge of the map. Not while the Iron Fangs refused to pull back from the river crossing. Dravik's grin was all teeth. We hold the crossing because the Hawks cannot. They would rather hide behind their wings and let others bleed. And yet, Catherine countered, your presence there stirs the rogues like a stick in a wasp's nest. I see smoke where your honor is meant to stand. Dravik's chair scraped against the floor as he rose, his body a coiled threat. Say that again. Enough, Lucien said, not raising his voice, but the word cut through the chamber like a drawn blade. The quiet didn't last. A messenger slipped inside, breathless from running. His words tumbled out in their ion so quickly that Juliet couldn't follow more than fragments. Talks ended, demands, tribute. Lucien's head lifted sharply. What tribute? The messenger hesitated, then glanced, almost apologetically, toward Juliet. Rhea's ears flicked back, and her voice was a low murmur. They want you. The chamber's focus shifted as if drawn by a single string. Dravik leaned back in his chair, a slow satisfaction curling his mouth. Catherine's expression didn't change, but his eyes glittered with a cold, sharp light. Juliet's stomach turned, but she forced her chin up, meeting their stares with a quiet defiance. And if I refuse? Catherine's tone was silk over steel. Then war is certain. The Hawks will not hold the north, the rogues will press through, and the clans will bleed. All because you would not make a small sacrifice. Juliet's laugh was hollow, a brittle sound that broke the tension. Small. Lucien's gaze was locked on her now, unreadable. You will not go. The words were final, carved in stone. And yet, as she looked at the circle of watching faces, the hunger in Dravik's smirk, the cold calculation in Catherine's eyes, the unspoken questions in the others, she knew what refusing would cost him. Her voice was steady when she spoke. I will go. But not as prey. If they want me, they get me as an envoy. The silence that followed was thick, electric. Lucien's jaw worked, the muscle in his cheek tightening. No. Then you go to war, she said, meeting his eyes. Your choice. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lucien stepped forward, the firelight catching in the gold of his gaze. His voice was low, almost quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room, a deep, resonating promise. If you go, he said, I follow. The chamber erupted in murmurs, the sound like a sudden wind through dry grass. Dravik's smirk slipped. Catherine's fingers tapped once against the table, slow and deliberate. Juliet didn't look away from Lucien. She couldn't. The murmurs in the council hall hadn't faded by the time the summons went out. A moonlight pact could not be spoken in private, not if it was to be recognized by every clan in their ion. It had to be witnessed, sealed under the open sky, with the moons themselves as arbiters. By nightfall, the hollow was full again. Torches lined the ring of stone seats, their flames bowing toward the center where a low altar of carved granite stood. Above it, the three moons had climbed into their appointed places, the blood orange to the west, the pale blue to the east, and the silver hanging high overhead like a watchful eye. Juliet stood at the altar's edge, the black cloak heavy across her shoulders, the new silver mark on her hand catching the torchlight. Rhea had braided her hair back from her face, weaving a thin cord of moon thread through it, both a sign of respect and a quiet defiance. Lucien approached from the opposite side, every step measured, every movement a testament to his controlled power. His armor gleamed with fresh oil, the runes etched into it catching and holding the silver light. When he stopped before her, the space between them was small enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the faint wild tang beneath the clean scent of leather and steel. The Serpentkin elder raised a clawed hand. Wolf King of the Northern Howl, human of the cliff's return, speak your terms. Lucien's gaze stayed on her, unblinking. I vow to guard her life as I guard my own. To shield her from blade, claw, and curse, until the moon herself releases me. The elder's gaze shifted to Juliet. And you, human? Juliet's heart pounded, but her voice was clear. I vow to stand beside him as an equal in word and act. To speak when silence is a lie, to act when stillness is surrender, and to keep my own path even when it leads into his shadow. A few murmurs at that, too bold, perhaps, for their ears, but she didn't look away. The elder's hood flared. Then bind it. Lucien held out his hand, palm up. Juliet placed hers in it. His grip was warm, calloused, and steady, enclosing her smaller hand without tightening. For a breath, nothing happened, just the sound of the wind through the torches, the far-off cry of some night bird. Then the silver moon flared. Light spilled down like water, flooding over them both. Where their hands joined, it burned, not painfully, but with a deep, searing certainty. The runes on Lucien's armor blazed, and the marks on Juliet's skin, both collarbone and hand, answered in the same silver fire. The light wrapped around them, a thin spiral that wound up their joined arms before vanishing into the night. Gasps rose from the gathered clans. A moonlight pact was unbreakable. Even death did not undo it, it only changed its form. Lucien didn't let go immediately. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment the crowd, the torches, even the moons felt far away. It's done, he said quietly, his voice a low, profound rumble. Catherine's voice slid into the stillness, smooth as a blade through silk. Then you've given me leverage, Wolf King. The envoy you guard so fiercely now binds you to her fate. Juliet's grip tightened instinctively, but Lucien only said, be careful how you use it. The elder lowered his hand. The pact is witnessed. The moons remember. The crowd began to disperse, but Juliet knew this was only the beginning. The silver fire might have marked them as bound, but in a land where prophecy still whispered in dark corners, it had also painted a brighter target on both their backs. And as she stepped down from the altar beside Lucien, their hands finally parting, she felt rather than saw the Hawkin's black eyes following her into the dark. Chapter 9, Moonlight Pacts. The road to the Hawk Eyrie cut through the highlands like a scar, narrow and winding, flanked on one side by sheer cliff faces and on the other by steep drops into valleys thick with silver ash forests. The wind was sharper here, carrying the scent of pine, wet stone, and the distant tang of snow. They rode in silence for most of the day. Lucien led, his black cloak streaming behind him, his mount moving with the steady, deliberate pace of a beast that could run for days without tiring. Juliet followed close enough to see the quiet flex of his shoulders when he shifted in the saddle, but far enough to pretend she wasn't watching. Rhea had wanted to come. Lucien refused. The pact binds only us, he'd said, and the quiet finality in his voice had ended the discussion. Juliet wasn't sure if it was meant to reassure her or to remind her that she was now tethered to him in a way no one else could undo. The Hawk Eyrie was 3 days away. 3 nights. And the first one came sooner than she expected. By dusk, the wind off the cliffs had teeth. They stopped in a small hollow where the rock face curved inward, offering some shelter. Lucien unsaddled the mounts without a word, his movements precise, economical. Juliet gathered what kindling she could find, her fingers stiff from the cold. The fire burned low but steady, throwing a pool of orange light that didn't quite reach the edges of the hollow. Juliet sat close to it, wrapping her cloak tighter. The heat barely touched her legs. The cold here was the kind that slipped beneath layers, curling into bone. Lucien was sorting gear on the far side of the fire when she noticed he pulled out a single bedroll. She frowned. "Where's mine?" "There is one," he said without looking up. "I meant mine, as in my own." He glanced at her then, the firelight catching the gold in his eyes. "You won't survive the night alone in this cold. We share." The words were matter-of-fact, not an offer, but a simple truth. Juliet's breath misted in the air. I'll manage. You won't, he said, unrolling the bedding. And the pact will make me carry you if you freeze. I'd rather avoid that. She bit back a retort. The truth was, her fingers were already numb despite the fire. Pride was a thin blanket against a mountain wind. When he settled onto the bedroll, he left a space beside him and lay back, one arm propped behind his head. You're losing heat. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Juliet hesitated for another heartbeat, then crossed the small space. She lowered herself onto the bedding, careful to keep her back to him. Even so, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a steady, profound warmth through the layers of her cloak and tunic. For a while, the only sound was the wind whistling along the cliffs and the soft crackle of the fire. Then, quietly, Lucien said, "You've been watching me since we left." Juliet stared at the fire. "You've been in front of me since we left." A faint huff of breath, almost amusement, escaped him. "Careful, Juliet. You're starting to sound like you belong here." She didn't answer. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she wasn't sure yet if she wanted to admit he might be right. The Hawk Eyrie rose from the mountains like a fortress carved from the very bones of the cliffs. Tall spires of white stone spiraled into the clouds, their edges feathered with carved wing motifs. Bridges of woven steel and enchanted rope arched between the towers, swaying gently in the high wind. Below, the mountain dropped away into a sheer, dizzying void. Juliet tried not to gape as they crossed the main causeway. Hawkkin moved above and below, gliding between towers on wide, dark wings. Every movement was precise, efficient, deliberate the way Lucien moved, she realized, but sharper, as if each step or flight was a statement of superiority. They were met in the courtyard by 3 Hawkkin sentinels. Their armor was light but gleaming, designed for flight. The leader stepped forward, his sharp black eyes assessing Juliet before cutting to Lucien. "You brought the human." His voice was clipped, every word honed like a blade. Lucien's expression did not change. "The pact binds her presence." A faint click of the Hawkin's beak. "It binds you more than her. Remember that." Inside, the negotiation chamber was all stone and wind, open on one side to the sheer drop. A wide table of polished blackwood stood at the center, etched with sigils. Juliet's eyes caught on them, familiar curves and lines, pieces of the language she had seen in Lucien's armor and the rune on her own skin. The Hawkkin ambassador sat at the head, his feathers shot with silver, his gaze a hawk's in every sense, still, patient, predatory. "Wolf King," he said. "You come for passage and trade." "I come," Lucien said evenly, "for the same accord we've had for 20 winters." The ambassador's gaze flicked to Juliet. "And you bring prophecy." Juliet's pulse kicked. Lucien didn't answer, but the Hawkkin leaned forward. "If the human bearer of light will doom the Wolf King, as the old song says, why should we aid you in keeping her alive?" It was an open challenge. Juliet felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. And then she saw the sigil carved into the table nearest her, a trade rune, one Rhea had taught her in passing. The shape for exchange. She stepped forward before she could think herself out of it. "Because," she said, her voice steady, "if you help him keep me alive, you earn something your rivals won't have." She traced the curve of the trade rune with her fingertip. "My knowledge. My craft. My hands. A healer who owes you." The ambassador's gaze sharpened, weighing her. "You know our sigils." "Enough to carve one if I must," she said. "Enough to make a pact of my own." A flicker of approval or calculation passed over his features. "We will discuss terms." The meeting dragged deep into night, but when they finally stepped out onto the open bridge, Lucien's jaw was less tense. "That was bold," he said, his voice pitched low against the wind. "It was necessary," she answered. He glanced sideways at her, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. "You're learning." That night, they were given a guest chamber high in one of the spires, round, with a wall open to the moonlit drop. The bed was wide enough for 2, though she doubted that was intended. She lay awake for a while, listening to the wind rush past the open archway. When Lucien shifted beside her, she turned her head. He was lying on his back, eyes closed, one arm draped across his chest as if holding something in place deep inside. Before she could second-guess herself, she reached out and placed her hand over his heart. His eyes opened instantly, locking on hers in the pale silver light. "You're too warm," she said softly. "You're too cold," he countered, his voice a low rumble. But he didn't move her hand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind roared beyond the stone walls, the moons hung heavy above, and beneath her palm, his heartbeat was a steady, profound rhythm and not entirely his own anymore. Chapter 10. The Sky Trial. Morning came on a rush of wind and cold sunlight. From the open archway, Juliet could see the mountain slopes falling away into mist, the distant valleys streaked with silver where rivers caught the light. The hawk eyrie woke with a flurry of movement, wings beating overhead, ropes creaking as platforms were raised and lowered between the spires. Lucien was already up, fastening the last clasp of his chest plate. His hair was unbound, falling loose to his shoulders, the black strands catching the pale morning light. He looked different without the constant shadow of his cloak, less a monarch carved of stone, more a predator ready to protect. "You'll stay here," he said without turning, his voice quiet but firm. Juliet blinked. "That wasn't a question. This is a Hawkkin custom," he continued. "They'll try to test me. It's not for you." "Then why are 3 armed sentinels standing outside the door?" she asked. That made him glance at her, a faint crease between his brows. "They're here to ensure you don't interfere." Juliet crossed her arms. "Or to ensure I don't escape." A muscle in his jaw shifted, but he didn't answer. They didn't get to argue further because the ambassador himself appeared in the doorway, flanked by guards. "Wolf King," he said, his tone clipped. "The wind is fair. The challenge flight begins now." Lucien's eyes narrowed. "I agreed to no challenge." "Perhaps not," the Hawkkin said smoothly, "but our council agreed to one for you. Unless you prefer to forfeit." His gaze slid briefly to Juliet, as if testing the edge of a blade. "We wouldn't want that, would we?" Juliet didn't understand the full implication, but she felt the sudden spike of tension from Lucien like heat radiating from stone. Minutes later, she found herself standing on a high platform carved into the cliffside, the drop yawning away beneath her. The hawk eyrie's spires rose in every direction, connected by narrow rope bridges and sheer stone faces. Dozens of Hawkkin watched from perches above. The challenge was simple. Rhea had once explained about these customs: reach the far spire before the other competitor. For Hawkkin, that meant flight. For anyone without wings, it meant surviving whatever they threw in your path. Lucien stood at the platform's edge, facing a Hawkkin champion whose armor shimmered like wet feathers. Between them, the wind whistled, a living thing that seemed eager for blood. The ambassador raised his arm. "Begin." The Hawkkin launched into the air with a snap of his wings, vanishing into the sky. Lucien leapt forward, not into flight, but into a powerful sprint that carried him across the first rope bridge in a blur of motion. Juliet gripped the stone railing so hard her knuckles whitened. She didn't see the trap until it was too late. From a shadowed ledge above, another Hawkkin dropped, not at Lucien, but toward her. The impact knocked her back from the railing, air leaving her lungs in a rush. Talons closed over her shoulder, sharp enough to pierce through the cloak's heavy fabric. The Hawkkin hissed something she couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear: "You are the real target." Juliet struggled, trying to twist away, but the platform had no guard on the open side. One wrong move and she'd be falling into the same endless drop she'd once chosen for herself. And this time, there might be no wolf to catch her. The world tilted beneath Juliet's feet. The wind roared in her ears, drowning out every sound but the wild, hammering panic in her chest. The Hawkkin's grip was iron, talons digging just enough to warn her they could pierce flesh at will. Far below, the mountainside blurred into streaks of grey and white. "Let go." Juliet choked, twisting, trying to bring the blade at her hip into reach. The Hawkkin's wings flared, a gust of air slamming into her face. His voice came in sharp, foreign syllables, spat like a curse. She caught only one word, repeated twice: "Omen." He shifted his grip, preparing to lift her, and that was when the air changed. A deeper wind cut through the mountain gusts, heavy, primal, charged with an instinct older than language. Juliet turned her head just as a black-clad shape dropped from above, faster than gravity, faster than thought. Lucien hit the hawkkin with the force of a falling star. The sound was more impact than cry, a dull, brutal thud, and then they were both rolling across the platform in a blur of claws, steel, and wings. The hawkkin shrieked, his talons scraping sparks from Lucien's armor before the Wolf King's hand closed around his throat. Lucien's golden eyes burned, not bright, but deep, molten, and dangerous. His voice was low enough that Juliet felt it more than heard it. "Touch her again," he said, "and you will learn how long it takes a hawk to fall." The hawkin's wings folded tight in submission. Lucien released him with a shove that sent him skidding to the platform's edge. Gasps rippled through the watching crowd above. The ambassador's voice rang out from a high balcony. "Wolf King, you abandon the challenge?" Lucien turned his head slowly, every movement deliberate, his shoulders rising and falling with a restrained fury. "I did not come here for sport," he said. "I came for alliance. If this is your idea of welcome, you will have neither." The ambassador's feathers ruffled in irritation, but he made no direct rebuke. "The Airy will review this matter." Lucien didn't wait for permission to leave. His hand closed around Juliet's arm, not roughly, but with the unshakable grip of someone who had almost lost hold of something precious, and he led her from the platform. Only when they were inside one of the narrow stone corridors did he stop. The light was dim here, the wind muted, the walls close enough to feel like a den. "Are you hurt?" His voice was sharper than a blade, but not in anger, more like he was cutting through anything that might keep him from the answer. Juliet shook her head. "Just," she swallowed. "Shaken." His gaze swept her from head to toe, lingering on the torn fabric at her shoulder where the talons had gripped her. The lines at the corners of his mouth deepened. "They set you up," he said. "They meant to pull me from the trial, to make me choose between winning and keeping you alive. And you chose me." She hadn't meant it to sound like a question, but it came out like one. Lucien's jaw flexed. "That is not a choice," he said quietly. The words lodged in her chest like something both heavy and fragile. "And now," he said, taking a slow breath as if reining himself back from something dangerous, "I make it clear to them that any threat to you is a threat to me. And they will learn quickly that I am not prey either." Juliet met his eyes, the heat of his hand still steady on her arm. "You can't fight everyone for me, Lucien." His mouth curved, not in amusement, but in something darker, a truth he couldn't quite hide. "Watch me." They stood there for a long moment, the wind outside whispering through the narrow slit of the window. It smelled of high air and coming snow. Finally, he released her arm, though his fingers brushed her sleeve a fraction longer than necessary. "Stay in your chamber tonight. Lock the door. If they come for you again, call my name." "And you'll hear it?" she asked. Lucien's gaze didn't waver. "Always." Chapter 11, Bound by Moon and Shadow. The Hawk Aries council chamber was an open ring of carved stone set high among the spires, its floor polished smooth by centuries of talons and bare feet. Thin curtains of woven reed hung from the pillars, fluttering in the mountain wind. The cold here was sharper than in the valley, a thin, piercing cold that seemed to strip away all pretense from words. Juliet stood just inside the archway, the king's cloak drawn close, the leather-wrapped blade at her hip feeling heavier than it had the day before. Lucien was a step ahead of her, his armor catching the thin shafts of morning light. The gold in his eyes was subdued now, not dulled, but banked, like embers under ash. The council of Hawkkin sat in a semicircle, each in a high-backed seat carved to resemble a wing in mid-spread. Their plumage was as varied as autumn leaves, russet, bronze, charcoal, bone-white. The ambassador from the day before occupied the center, his feathers slicked close to his body, his beak dipping as he regarded Lucien. This assembly was not convened for a wolf, the ambassador began, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. It was called to address the breach of airy law that occurred yesterday. His gaze flicked to Juliet, and the faintest curl of his beak made the hairs on her neck rise. Lucien's reply was calm, almost conversational. "The breach was yours." A ripple of disapproval passed through the Hawkkin seats, feathers rustling like dry leaves. The ambassador's beak clicked. "A challenge flight is a sacred right. You abandoned it mid-course." "To keep my ward alive," Lucien said. The ambassador's tone sharpened. You mean the human omen? The one whose presence here is already a stain on the sky. Juliet's fingers curled into the cloak, but she kept her eyes forward, letting the words slide over her skin without response. She'd learned in the Wolf King's court that silence could be more dangerous than protest. It let the opponent keep speaking, keep revealing their teeth. Lucien didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You set an assassin on her. That is a claim, the ambassador said smoothly, without proof. Lucien took a slow step forward, and the air in the chamber seemed to shift. The proof is that I stand here instead of your champion. If it happens again, I will not bring the offender back alive for questioning. The Hawkkin shifted in their seats, some with irritation, some with wary approval. The ambassador's eyes narrowed. You threaten the Eyrie in its own hall? Lucien's tone cooled. I speak for the moon. That silenced them. For the first time since they'd entered, Juliet saw genuine hesitation ripple through the Hawkkin council. The words weren't a boast, they were a claim of authority that reached beyond tribe and territory, into the shared spiritual law that bound every beastkin under the moon's gaze. You invoke a pact? The ambassador asked, his feathers lifting in disbelief. Lucien turned his head slightly, his voice lowering, but carrying in the quiet. The night the human fell, the moon called her to me. I bound her to my protection under the light of all three moons. That vow cannot be challenged, not by you, not by any clan. Juliet's stomach tightened. Bound? He'd never used that word before. The ambassador's gaze flicked to her again, sharper this time. Then her life is tied to yours. The words felt heavier than the mountain air. Juliet's fingers pressed into the edge of the cloak, her pulse quickening. She wanted to ask, what does that mean? How deep does this bond go? But the chamber wasn't the place for questions. The ambassador sat back slowly. Then the Eyrie will respect the moon's decree. For now. Lucien inclined his head once, an acknowledgement without gratitude. When they left the chamber, Juliet kept pace beside him until the door of the private guest hall closed behind them. Only then did she speak. You bound me. Her voice wasn't an accusation, but it carried the sharpness of something that demanded an answer. Lucien stopped, turning to face her fully. I saved you. That's not the same thing. His gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. In their ion, it is. Juliet stood in the narrow guest chamber, the wind from the high window slicing through the air like a blade. Lucien hadn't moved since he'd spoken, but the space between them felt charged, as if an invisible thread pulled taut from his chest to hers. You're saying, she began slowly, that the moment I fell into this world, you tied me to you. Lucien's tone was measured, but not defensive. The pact was not planned. It was instinct. The moons chose you, I only answered. Her pulse was a sharp beat in her ears. You keep saying that the moons chose me. What does that actually mean? He stepped closer, not looming, but close enough that the firelight caught in the deep gold of his eyes. A moonlight pact is older than any crown, older than the first wolf howl. When it is sworn, it binds lives together. My life for yours. Your life for mine. The words dropped like stones into her stomach. So if I die, he said simply. And if I fall, the bond drags you with me. The chamber seemed smaller, the air thinner. You never told me. You would have run, he said, without hesitation, as if it were the most obvious truth. Juliet's laugh was dry and humorless. You think I can run now? His jaw tightened, the scar along it catching the light. The pact cannot be broken without blood. She swallowed. Whose blood? A beat of silence. Both. Her fingers curled into the edge of the cloak. So we're, what? Tethered until one of us kills the other? Lucien's gaze didn't waver. Or until the moons release us. But they do not often change their mind. Juliet turned away, staring at the slit of sky visible beyond the window. The highest moon, silver and full, hung there like an unblinking eye. The same one she'd seen her first night here, when she'd thought she was safe in his hut. She'd thought his protection was a choice, not a sentence. She felt his presence behind her, not moving closer, but not stepping away. You think this is a chain, he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. It is. But it is also a shield. A shield for who? she asked, her voice catching. You. Or me? His reply was a low rumble, like distant thunder. For both. The words should have been reassuring, but they felt heavy, threaded with something unspoken. Something that told her he hadn't bound her only out of duty, but out of a deep and terrifying necessity she didn't yet understand. Juliet didn't turn to face him. She wasn't ready, not yet. But in the corner of the window's light, she saw the faint glint of silver on her collarbone, where the rune pulsed softly against her skin. It didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like the first link in a chain she was already starting to carry. The wind at this height was knife-sharp, smelling of snow and the faint metallic tang of the Hawkins spires. Juliet kept the cloak wrapped tight as she followed Lucien down the narrow stone path that spiraled toward the lower passes. Rhea walked ahead of them, her light steps almost soundless on the frost-hardened stone. Every so often, Lucien's hand would brush Juliet's elbow, not holding, just guiding when the path narrowed to little more than a ledge above a sheer drop. The contact sent a peculiar ripple through her chest, as if her pulse adjusted to match his. She told herself it was just the wind, just nerves. But each time he touched her, the sensation came again. The pact, she thought. The invisible thread. They descended in silence until the spires were shadows above them and the forest spread below in a dark, endless sea. Rhea's ears twitched as she glanced back. The Hawkkin are watching from the high perches. They'll want to see if you leave together. Juliet frowned. Why? To measure the space between you, Rhea said simply. A pact like this, it shows in the way you move. In the way you breathe. Juliet didn't answer. She didn't want to think about her breathing. She didn't want to think about how, when Lucien slowed, her own pace seemed to match without thought, or how her gaze kept sliding toward him, as if to check that he was still there. By the time they reached the tree line, shadows had deepened to that strange, silver-blue dusk unique to Therion's wilds. The trees here were thick-barked and towering, their roots twisted into the shape of old wounds. Lucien paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the undergrowth. We keep moving, he said. The Ares truce will not hold long. They pressed on, the forest closing around them. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf's howl rose, a long, low note that made Juliet's skin prickle. Lucien's head turned slightly toward the sound, nostrils flaring, but he didn't answer it. It wasn't until they stopped at a small riverside hollow to drink that Juliet noticed it, his shoulders, tense in a way they hadn't been since leaving the eyrie. His gaze kept flicking to the tree line. What is it? She asked, kneeling by the water. Lucien didn't look at her. You're too far. She glanced up sharply. Too far from what? From me. She straightened, confused. I'm right here. His gaze finally met hers, and in the dim light she saw something raw behind the gold, an instinctive unease. The bond doesn't care about sight. It measures the space between heartbeats. Juliet stared at him, water dripping from her fingers back into the stream. You can feel it. His voice was low, almost reluctant. Always. She didn't know whether to feel comforted or trapped. The forest around them whispered with wind and running water, but the only sound she could truly hear was the quiet, steady rhythm of her own pulse, now unshakably aware that somewhere, deep inside, it had found a second beat to match. They camped in a hollow between two great silver pines, their roots forming a natural wall against the wind. Lucien's movements were efficient, stacking kindling, sparking fire with a twist of flint, while Rhea disappeared into the trees to scout for food. Juliet sat on the fur-lined bedroll Rhea had laid out earlier, watching the flames catch. The warmth licked against the chill in her bones, but it didn't untangle the knot low in her stomach. It wasn't just the exhaustion of travel, it was him. The bond. The knowledge that, somewhere under the surface of her own thoughts, she could feel him. It was faint, like the echo of footsteps in another room. A quiet, steady presence. Lucien sat across from her, one knee bent, his forearm resting over it. His gaze was fixed on the flames, but his posture was different than she'd ever seen, less like a king on guard, more like a man trying not to think. You keep watching me, she said softly. His golden eyes lifted to hers, a quiet question in their depths. I'm listening. To what? His answer came without hesitation. You. She swallowed. I'm not speaking. A beat of silence. Then, you are. The fire popped, sending a curl of smoke into the cold night. Juliet tried to look away, but her gaze betrayed her, tracing the scar along his jaw, the faint hollow beneath his cheekbone. What does the bond tell you? Lucien's jaw flexed, as if he weighed whether to answer. That you are unsettled. That you do not trust the ground you stand on. That when you close your eyes, you remember the cliff. The breath caught in her chest. She shook her head. That's too much. It is what it is, he said, his voice low. I cannot shut it out any more than you can. She stared at him across the fire, the heat between them now something different than flame. What do you feel now? His gaze didn't waver. You're wondering what I feel. Juliet's lips parted, but no sound came. She wasn't sure she wanted the answer until his expression changed. Not softened, exactly, but deepened, as though he'd let one thin layer slip. I feel, he said slowly, the way I used to before battle. When the air is too still, and you know a storm is coming, but you cannot see the sky yet. The words should have chilled her. Instead, they curled around her spine like something dangerous but not unwelcome. Rhea returned before Juliet could speak again, carrying 2 small game birds and a pouch of berries. She glanced between them, her ears twitching in faint suspicion, then busied herself with the meal. Later, when they lay in their separate bedrolls, the forest quiet save for the sigh of the wind, Juliet stared at the moons through the gap in the branches. She could feel him still awake, even with his eyes closed. And when her own heartbeat began to slow, she realized, with a strange sort of dread and a deep, quiet certainty, that his had slowed to match. Chapter 12. The Trial of Sigils. The hollow had been remade for the trial, but not with brutal force. Where once there had been rough-hewn seats of root and stone, the center was now a bare, smooth circle, its floor swept clean and ringed by carved pillars. Each pillar bore the elegant mark of a clan wolf, lion, serpent, hawk, and more etched deep into the stone and glinting faintly under the high silver moon. Juliet stood at the circle's edge, Rhea at her side adjusting the fall of her ceremonial tunic. The thread shimmered faintly in the moonlight, catching on the silver embroidery like water over glass. Her blade hung at her hip, light enough to forget until her hand brushed it, a quiet reassurance of her place in this strange new world. Lucien was already inside the ring, speaking low with the serpentkin elder who had called for the trial. He wore no crown tonight, no heavy armor, only a tunic of deep black and a mantle edged with wolf fur. But the sigils on his forearms glowed faintly, alive with a quiet, pulsing energy that seemed to mirror the moons above. Rhea's voice was a soft murmur in her ear. Remember, no blood. No mistakes. The line must be unbroken, or the stone rejects you. And then what? Juliet asked, her mouth dry. Rhea didn't look at her, her gaze fixed on the ceremonial stone. Then you will not walk out. The elder stepped forward, his voice carrying like a hiss through the circle. The trial of sigils is an old one. No beastkin child takes their name without passing it. To carve the language of the first moons is to claim you can speak to the land itself. And if you fail, someone in the crowd called. The elder smiled thinly. Then the land will not keep you. Juliet's throat tightened. Lucien's gaze found her then, steady and unreadable. He didn't nod, didn't speak, but the weight of his eyes was enough. It said, "Watch me," without words, a silent promise. A young wolfkin warrior approached, carrying a slab of raw, unmarked stone. It was no bigger than Juliet's chest, but the surface was unyielding, black as night and veined with silver. He set it gently at her feet. A long-handled carving blade was offered next. Juliet took it carefully, the weight of it strange in her hand, lighter than her weapon, but alive in a different way, as though it was waiting for her to begin. The rune you carve, the elder said, must speak your name to the moons. Not the name your mother gave you, but the name that belongs to your spirit. Juliet looked at the stone, and the stone seemed to look back. The crowd fell silent. Somewhere, beyond the circle, she could hear the wind shifting through the silver trees. She thought of the night she had arrived here, of Lucien's arms around her, of the strange, soft pulse of the sigil at her collarbone. And faintly, almost too faintly to notice, she could feel him. Steady. Waiting. She crouched beside the stone and touched its cold surface with the tip of the blade. And then, without thinking, she began to carve. The first cut bit deep, the silver vein in the stone flashing bright under the moon. Gasps rippled through the gathered clans. Juliet ignored them. She wasn't thinking about what mark to make, wasn't planning lines or curves, she simply let the movement come, her hand guided by something older than thought. The blade moved in fluid arcs, each stroke following the last as though they had been waiting centuries for her to arrive. The hiss of metal against stone filled the hollow, a soft, singing sound. Somewhere, at the edge of her senses, she could feel Lucien, still, but not calm. His pulse in the bond was sharper now, as though he recognized something in her movements before she did. When she lifted the blade, the rune was nearly complete, a spiral of intertwined lines, sharp at the edges, flowing at the center, the curves forming a crescent cradling a single point of light where the silver vein bled through. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. But the stone wasn't finished. The surface beneath her hands began to hum, faint at first, then growing until she could feel it in her bones. The silver vein flared, bright enough to paint her face in pale light, and the air in the hollow shifted with a quiet, profound magic. The serpentkin elder's voice was sharp. "Step back." Juliet didn't move. The carved lines in the stone began to glow, the silver seeping into every stroke she had made until the rune blazed like moonlight caught in water. And then the light sank back into the stone, leaving the surface smooth, the cuts sealed as if they had always been a part of it. Whispers broke out around her. Rhea stepped forward, her tail still, her ears flat against her head. "That's not possible," she murmured in their tongue. Juliet turned to Lucien. "What just happened?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low, meant only for her. "The stone accepted you." "I thought that was the point," she whispered. "It is," he said, his golden eyes fixed on the glowing mark, "but it does not accept strangers." The lion matriarch rose from her seat, her manner catching the moonlight. "What is that rune, Wolf King?" "I have not seen it in 100 seasons." Lucien's jaw was tight. "It is the mark of the moon's chosen." A low, uneasy murmur spread through the clans. The Hawkkin ambassador's feathers ruffled, his voice sharp. "The prophecy speaks of a human bearer of light. Will you deny this is the sign?" Juliet's pulse thudded in her ears. All eyes were on her now, not with curiosity, but with something heavier, sharper. Lucien stepped forward, placing himself between her and the council. "Prophecies are bent by the ones who speak them," he said, his voice like a warning growl. The lion matriarch bared her teeth in something between a smile and a challenge. "Then let us see how far this one can bend before it breaks." Juliet didn't need the bond to know Lucien's control was hanging by a thread. When he took her arm to lead her from the hollow, his grip was firm, not unkind, but absolute. And beneath the heat of his hand, she could feel the truth. Whatever the rune meant, it had just changed everything. Chapter 13. The Mark Between Us. Lucien didn't speak as they left the hollow. The torches along the path back to the great den threw long shadows across his face, turning the sharp lines of his jaw into something cut from midnight itself. His hand remained at Juliet's elbow, not painfully tight, but a firm, steady presence. She could feel the heat of him even through the thick fabric of her sleeve. The village quieted as they passed. Beastkin bowed their heads or turned away entirely, as though looking at her now might risk drawing the moon's attention. A few stared openly, their expressions unreadable, though none dared step into Lucien's path. Inside the den, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of pine resin and smoke. Lucien led her through the stone corridors without pause until they reached a high, arched chamber lit only by the central hearth. The flames cast a golden glow over the wolf pelts lining the floor, over the dark runes carved into the walls, sigils that seemed to shift in the firelight as though they breathed. When he finally released her, the absence of his hand was almost dizzying. Juliet stepped back, crossing her arms. "Are you going to tell me what just happened?" Lucien turned away from her, bracing his hands on the long table near the hearth. His shoulders were tense, the muscles shifting beneath the black of his tunic. "You carved a rune that no human should be able to touch, let alone complete." "I told you I wasn't thinking about it," she said. "It just happened." "That," he said sharply, "is the problem." She flinched at the bite in his voice. So it's my fault. His head turned, the fire catching in his eyes. It's not about fault. It's about what the clans will do with this. That mark binds you to the prophecy in their minds, no matter what you or I say. Juliet's throat felt tight. And the prophecy says I'll doom you. Lucien's jaw worked, but he didn't look away. It says the human bearer of light will doom the Wolf King. The rest of the words are lost to time. Convenient, she muttered. He pushed away from the table and closed the distance between them. Do you think I wanted this bond? Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. Do you think I did? For a moment, they just stood there, the air between them stretched thin and electric. Then Lucien's voice dropped, quiet but sharp enough to cut. Whether either of us wanted it doesn't matter anymore. The moon chose. The stone accepted. And now every step you take will be watched. Juliet met his gaze, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then watch me. The words left her before she could swallow them back, and something in his expression shifted, not softer, exactly, but different. He stepped back, the connection breaking like a thread pulled too tight. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we speak to no one but each other. Juliet didn't ask why. She already knew. The moment in the hollow hadn't just bound her to him in the eyes of the clans. It had bound her to him in truth. Sleep didn't come easily. Juliet lay on the low bed of furs in the chamber Lucien had given her, the flicker of the small oil lamp casting soft shadows across the curved stone walls. Outside, the night was alive, the sigh of the wind through the silver-leaf trees, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant, lonely call of something that might have been a wolf. And somewhere, not far, a deep, steady heartbeat that didn't belong to her. She pressed her palm against the mark beneath her collarbone. It felt warm, warmer than it should, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the glowing rune she had carved, its lines curling like smoke, its silver light bleeding into her skin. A soft knock broke the stillness. Before she could answer, the door shifted open and Lucien stepped inside. He didn't wear armor now, only a loose tunic and dark trousers, but the space seemed to shrink around him all the same. "You're awake," he said. "I wasn't sleeping." He moved to the small table by the wall, setting down a clay cup. Steam curled from its rim. "Drink this. It will ease your mind." Juliet sat up, pulling the furs tighter around her shoulders. "Is that an order?" His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "A suggestion." She took the cup. The tea was bitter, with a strange, floral undertone, and it settled into her stomach like warmth blooming outward. "Why are you here, Lucien?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he paced once, slowly, then came to stand near the foot of her bed. "The bond between us, it's stronger than it should be." Juliet's fingers tightened around the cup. "Bond? When you carved the rune, something aligned. The moon doesn't choose without reason." His gaze was steady, but there was something in it she couldn't name, wary, almost reluctant. "I can feel you." She swallowed. "Feel me how?" His jaw tightened, as if the words cost him something. "When you're afraid. When you're angry. When you..." He stopped, looking away, the shadows catching along the hard line of his throat. "It is not constant, but it is there. And it will grow." The tea's heat seemed to rise into her cheeks. "So what you're saying, we're connected?" "Yes." His voice was low, unyielding. "And the clans will sense it soon enough. That is why you must stay close to me." Juliet set the cup aside. "Close, or under control?" His eyes returned to hers, sharp as a blade. "Sometimes they are the same thing." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire outside the doorway crackled faintly, a thread of warmth in the cool air between them. Finally, Lucien stepped back. "Rest. I'll be near." And then he was gone, the scent of pine and smoke lingering in his wake. Juliet lay back down, her pulse unsteady. She told herself the tea was what made her feel so warm, so restless. But when she closed her eyes, the bond hummed softly in her chest, as if somewhere, in another room, the Wolf King was not sleeping either. Chapter 14. Beneath the Council's Shadow. The morning broke with a thin veil of mist clinging to the village, turning the silver-leaf trees into pale ghosts. Juliet stood at the threshold of the great den, the king's cloak heavy across her shoulders, watching beastkin move in purposeful silence. She could feel their eyes on her, furtive glances, quickly averted, as though her presence might invite ill fortune. Rhea appeared at her side, her tail flicking in faint agitation. The summons came at dawn. The council meets again. Juliet's stomach tightened. I thought they made their judgment after the trial. They did, Rhea said, her voice low. Now they will test whether you can keep it. Lucien emerged from the shadows behind them, already armored. The silver runes on his pauldrons caught the weak sunlight, and his golden eyes held that unreadable depth she was beginning to recognize, not indifference, but a deep, careful calculation. You will stand beside me, he said. Not a request, but a statement of unwavering fact. Juliet matched his gaze. And if I don't? For the briefest moment, something flickered in his expression, amusement, perhaps, or the ghost of a challenge. Then you'll stand alone. And they will eat you alive. The hollow was already crowded when they arrived. Elders and war leaders from each clan filled the carved stone seats, their colors and sigils vivid against the pale stone. The lion matriarch sat upright, her golden maner braided with red beads that gleamed like droplets of blood. The Hawkkin ambassador loomed in his feathered cloak, his sharp eyes unblinking. Lucien took his place at the center, and Juliet stepped into the circle beside him. She felt the weight of every gaze like the heat of an open flame. The Serpentkin elder raised a long, scaled hand. Wolf King, we honor your trial's outcome, but the matter of the human is not settled. Lucien's voice was calm, steady. She passed the trial of the sigil. She is under my protection. And yet, the Hawkkin cut in, his voice sharp as talons, a protection bound by the moon is a protection bound in blood. If she carries your mark, she is part of your den. If she fails your den, she fails you. Juliet's breath caught. She hadn't agreed to be part of anything. The lion matriarch leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Juliet. We propose approving. A public test, not of magic, but of loyalty. Rhea's tail stilled beside her. They mean the circle, she whispered. Juliet glanced at her. What's the circle? Before Rhea could answer, Lucien spoke. No. The single word was a blade in the air. The council stirred. You fear she will fail? The Hawkkin asked, his voice smooth with provocation. Lucien's gaze turned to ice. I fear wasting the council's time on challenges unworthy of it. But Juliet, feeling the burn of every watching eye, stepped forward before she could think better of it. What's the circle? She asked, her voice carrying enough to be heard. The lion matriarch's smile was slow, almost approving. A ring of warriors from each clan. One who stands in the circle must remain standing when it ends. Juliet swallowed hard. And if I fall? Then you are prey, the Hawkkin said simply. Lucien's hand brushed her arm, the smallest, quietest touch, but it sent a strange heat through her. You are not doing this, he murmured. Juliet met his eyes. If I keep hiding behind you, they'll never see me as anything else. Something dangerous flickered in his gaze. Juliet. But the matriarch was already standing, raising her voice for all to hear. By moon's rise, the human enters the circle. The training yard lay behind the great den, an open ring of packed earth bordered by tall posts strung with wolf banners. The air was thick with the scent of dust, leather, and sweat. Lucien's warriors moved through sparring drills in the early dusk, their shadows long beneath the orange glow of the setting sun. Juliet stood at the edge, the king's cloak heavy over her shoulders, the blade he'd given her resting at her hip. She could feel every curious glance from the warriors, some amused, others openly hostile. Lucien stepped into the ring, motioning her forward. You will learn enough to stay on your feet, he said. Not win, she asked, following. His gaze flicked to hers. In the circle, survival is victory. He handed her a wooden training blade, the weight clumsy in her palm compared to the real one. He moved behind her, adjusting the set of her shoulders with one hand, guiding her stance with the other. His touch was light but precise, and she could feel the controlled heat of him, steady, but caged. Your center of gravity is too high, he murmured, his voice a low rumble just for her. Bend your knees. If they push, you move with it, not against. She obeyed, the dirt crunching under her boots. And if they hit me? Then you don't let them. The drills began. First, deflecting a blow. Then sidestepping. Each time, Lucien corrected her, his movements smooth, almost impossibly fast when he demonstrated. She found herself watching the way he flowed from one stance to the next, more predator than man. After an hour, her arms burned and sweat beaded at her temple. She stumbled in the dirt, catching herself with a hand. Lucien was there instantly, his grip firm around her wrist, pulling her upright. "Enough for tonight," he said. "I can go longer." His eyes narrowed. "Pride will get you killed faster than weakness." Juliet's jaw tightened. "Or it'll keep me from being seen as prey." The silence between them was thick. Then, without warning, Lucien took her blade from her hand and tossed it aside. He stepped forward until the heat of his body was close enough to make her breath hitch. "They will come at you to make me bleed," he said, his voice a low growl. "If you fall, they'll smell my failure. If you stand, if you so much as bare your teeth, they will start to wonder what I see in you." Her pulse skipped. "And what do you see in me?" The question hung there, dangerous and soft. Lucien's gaze held hers for a heartbeat longer than it should have. Then he stepped back, the distance between them a deliberate act of will. "We'll see tomorrow," he said, and turned away. Juliet stood in the cooling yard long after he'd gone, the scent of dust and pine in the air, her wrist still tingling where his hand had been. Far above, the first of the 3 moons had risen, casting its pale silver light over the village. Tomorrow, the circle would decide if she was prey or something else entirely. Chapter 15, The Circle of Teeth. The hollow was transformed. Torches burned in tall iron sconces, their flames swaying in the night wind. The 3 moons hung above in their strange harmony, silver, blood orange, and faint blue, casting shifting colors over the packed earth of the circle. Beastkin crowded the stone tiers, their voices a low, anticipatory hum, every face turned toward the stage of the coming trial. Juliet stood just beyond the torchlight, the king's cloak heavy and warm on her shoulders, the blade at her hip a silent weight. Rhea tightened the leather braces on her wrists, her fox-like ears angled back, her expression a mix of worry and pride. "Remember," Rhea whispered, "you don't have to beat them. You just have to remain standing." Juliet's fingers curled into the cloak. "And if I don't? Then they call you prey. And prey doesn't stay in their ion." Before Juliet could answer, the crowd stirred. Lucien stepped into the circle, his armor gleaming with silver runes, his powerful presence quieting the restless noise. His golden eyes swept over the assembled clans before he spoke, his voice carrying with a deep, resonant authority. "Tonight," he said, "the circle will decide if the moon kept her for a reason or only for a moment." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Juliet felt the heat of their attention shift to her as Lucien gestured for her to enter. She walked into the ring, the dirt cool under her boots, the air thick with the smell of smoke and fur and steel. The opponents emerged one by one, 5 warriors, each from a different clan. A wolfkin with scars across his muzzle. A hawkkin with feathers braided into his hair. A lionfolk with shoulders like carved stone. A serpentkin whose hood flared with each breath. And a tall foxwoman whose eyes were as sharp as her twin blades. They formed a loose circle around Juliet. "Begin," the serpentkin elder rasped from the high seat. The hawkkin moved first, lunging low with a sweeping kick meant to drop her. Juliet stumbled but pivoted, using Lucien's lesson, move with it, not against, to keep her balance. The crowd hissed in surprise. The lionfolk came next, a heavy shove that sent her skidding across the dirt. Pain flared in her hip, but she forced herself up. "Stay standing. Stay standing." The foxwoman darted in, her twin blades flashing, not to cut, but to intimidate. Juliet raised her own blade, catching the strike on instinct. The impact jarred her arms, but she held her ground. Cheers rose from somewhere in the crowd, faint, but real. Then the wolfkin stepped forward, his eyes fixed on her, his stance low. She saw it in the tightening of his shoulders before it happened. He wasn't aiming for her. He was aiming for the king. He lunged with deliberate ferocity, forcing Juliet toward the edge where Lucien stood. She stumbled again, nearly falling into the torchlight. A growl rolled through the hollow, not from the crowd, but from Lucien himself, a low, dangerous sound. Juliet steadied herself, her heart pounding, and bared her teeth, not a smile, not fear, but something raw and defiant. The wolfkin hesitated, just for a breath, and in that sliver of hesitation she shoved back. Hard. The circle roared. The wolfkin's boots slid in the dirt from the force of Juliet's shove. His lips peeled back in a snarl, sharp teeth flashing under the moon's light. The crowd howled in approval, some for her, others for the blood they sensed might spill. Juliet's chest heaved. Her fingers ached from gripping the blade too tightly, but she didn't dare loosen her hold. The hawkkin struck next, wings flaring as he leapt, his shadow sweeping over her like a storm. She ducked under the arc of his talons, feeling one graze the top of her shoulder. The sting made her wince, but she stayed upright. Stand, she told herself under her breath. Just stand. The lionfolk moved in with a shove that was no longer a test but an attack. She staggered back and the foxwoman swept in from the side, her blades crossing in a mock-killing blow that stopped just shy of Juliet's throat. The circle jeered. She wavers, someone shouted in the beastkin tongue. Juliet's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her breath was ragged now, her arms trembling from deflecting strike after strike. She could see the strategy forming, wear her down, let her crumble in front of everyone. Then the wolfkin came again, but this time he didn't aim for her body. He went for the blade. His hand shot out, claws hooking under the hilt. Juliet refused to let go, and for a heartbeat they were locked in a pull of pure strength and will. Then he jerked her forward too hard, too sudden, and she fell against him, the scent of hot fur and iron filling her senses. A deep, unearthly growl ripped through the night. It wasn't hers. Lucien was in the circle before anyone could blink, his golden eyes lit with something feral, his hand clamped around the wolfkin's throat. The other warriors froze, the crowd going deathly silent. The wolfkin's feet left the ground. "No one touches what is under my moon," Lucien said, the words low and dangerous, each syllable vibrating like a drumbeat in Juliet's bones. The wolfkin's claws twitched, but he made no move to fight back. Lucien dropped him hard enough that the ground seemed to shudder. Juliet's pulse was still hammering, her breath uneven. She wanted to tell him she didn't need saving, but the truth was if he hadn't stepped in, she might not be standing. The serpentkin elder's voice cut the silence. "The circle has seen enough." Murmurs rippled. Lucien didn't look at them. He looked only at Juliet, his gaze running over her as if to check for wounds he didn't trust anyone else to find. "You stood," he said finally, his voice quieter now. Her throat was dry. "Barely." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a frown. "Barely is enough." The crowd began to disperse, some muttering their displeasure, others watching her with a new, uneasy respect. The warriors left the ring one by one, save the foxwoman, who gave Juliet a lingering look, something between warning and curiosity, before melting into the shadows. Lucien stepped close enough for his voice to be for her alone. "You will not be put in that circle again." Juliet swallowed. "Because I passed." His gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. "Because next time, I won't stop at a warning." And with that, he turned away, his presence cutting through the night like a blade. Chapter 16, Defiance in the Hollow. The great den smelled of smoke and rain when they returned. The torches along the walls burned low, casting the chamber in a restless, shifting half-light. Juliet trailed behind Lucien, the king's cloak dragging faint lines in the dirt floor. She could still feel the circle under her boots, the packed grit, the heat of too many eyes, the pulse of her own fear, now fading into a quiet, buzzing energy. Rhea peeled away toward the side hall, murmuring something about herbs for the scratches on Juliet's shoulder. Lucien didn't stop until they reached the central chamber, its stone floor etched with runes that caught and reflected the flickering light. He didn't sit on the carved throne at the far end. He didn't even turn toward her. "You shouldn't have interfered," Juliet said, breaking the silence. The words came out sharper than she'd meant, but her blood was still running hot from the fight. Lucien's back rose and fell with a measured breath. "You were losing. I was holding." He turned then, and the golden burn of his gaze pinned her in place. "Holding is one step from falling." Juliet's hands tightened at her sides. "Then let me fall. Isn't that the point of the trial?" To see if I can stand without you. A muscle in his jaw flexed. He stepped toward her, slow and deliberate, until the space between them was a taut wire. The point of the trial, he said, his voice low and dangerous, was to see if the clans would accept you. It was not to give them the pleasure of breaking you. Her breath caught not at the words, but at the deep, protective truth she heard beneath them. He had been ready to kill for her. She wanted to thank him, and she wanted to shout at him in the same breath. Instead, she said nothing, her gaze shifting to the runes on the floor. They still don't accept me, she murmured. Not yet. His voice softened, but only slightly. Respect is carved in the long winters, not in a single night. Juliet met his eyes again. And what about you? Do you respect me yet? He didn't answer right away. His gaze searched hers, something unreadable moving in the gold. I don't keep things I can't respect, he said finally, the words landing heavier than she expected. From somewhere deeper in the den, a low howl rolled through the stone, followed by another, shorter, sharper. Lucien's head turned slightly, listening. The clans are restless, he said. The circle has given them something to whisper about. Juliet folded her arms. And you? His gaze flicked back to her. I don't whisper. He turned away before she could press him further, calling for Rhea. Rhea entered the chamber at Lucien's call, her ears flicking as her gaze darted between them. She carried a shallow wooden bowl, steam curling from its surface, the sharp scent of crushed mint and bark rising with it. Drink, she told Juliet, pressing the bowl into her hands. It will steady your heart. Juliet didn't realize until she lifted it how badly her fingers trembled. She took a careful sip, the taste was bitter and grounding, pulling her breath back into rhythm. Lucien spoke without looking at her. Word will travel fast. By moonrise tomorrow, the Hawkkin will demand a hearing. Rhea's tail stilled. On what grounds? They'll say the human disrupted the circle, Lucien replied. His tone was steady, but the underlying heat was unmistakable. And they'll be right. Juliet lowered the bowl. If they want me gone, why bother with hearings? Why not just, she cut herself off, unwilling to give voice to the thought. Because, Rhea said softly, the Hawkkin are predators of a different kind. They don't take what they can humiliate into surrender. Lucien stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the runes at their feet. They will try to trap you with words. If you fail to answer them, they'll call for exile. Juliet's mouth went dry. I don't know your laws. Your politics. How am I supposed to defend myself? You won't, he said simply. I will. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't, not when his eyes held that same, unyielding light. And what do you want from me in return? She asked carefully. Lucien didn't hesitate. I want you to listen. To learn. No more wandering the village without Rhea. No more facing challenges without my consent. Her brows knit. So I'm just, yours to guard. You're mine to keep alive, he corrected. The words were a collar, one she wasn't sure she wanted, and yet, she couldn't entirely hate the weight of it. Before she could answer, a deep, resonant drumbeat echoed from somewhere above. Lucien's gaze shifted upward. The council's summons. They move faster than I thought. Rhea's ears twitched. Then the hearing will be at moonrise. Lucien nodded once, then turned back to Juliet. Rest. Eat. When the Hawkkin come for you, I want them to see you standing. He left before she could reply, his cloak sweeping the air like the closing wing of a great bird. Juliet stared into the last curls of steam from her drink, her reflection warped and shimmering. She had faced claws, teeth, and the weight of the circle. But something in her gut told her that tomorrow's battle, fought with words and eyes instead of steel, would cut far deeper. And if she failed, it wouldn't be the Hawkkin who ended her place here. It would be the king. The hollow looked different at night. The moons hung high and bright above, their silver light drenching the amphitheater in a cold, cutting clarity that no torch could match. The ancient stone seats were filled not just with the council of clans, but with observers from the village and beyond. Feathers, fur, and scales caught the light like a living tapestry, every head turning with a rustling murmur as Juliet descended the steps at Rhea's side. Lucien was already at the center, arms folded, his presence anchoring the space with the same silent authority he always carried. But tonight, his shoulders were tauter, the lines of his jaw sharper. He had dressed in ceremonial armor, the silver inlays gleaming like trapped moonlight against the deep, comforting darkness of the metal. Across from him stood the Hawkkin delegation, 3 tall figures draped in layered robes of midnight and sky blue, their movements fluid and silent. Their faces were sharp, every line and angle honed like a blade, and their eyes were obsidian, black from lid to lid, reflecting nothing of the moon's gentle glow. The tallest, marked by a circlet of polished bone that seemed to absorb the very light, stepped forward. "Wolf King," he said, voice smooth as oiled steel yet carrying a subtle, chilling edge, "we are summoned to speak of the human you shelter." Lucien's tone was flat, devoid of welcome but firm. "You are summoned to hear her speak for herself." The Hawkkin leader's gaze slid to Juliet, raking over her from head to toe with an unnerving stillness. "Then let the human speak. Tell us, prey creature, why you walk our sacred ground, wear the wolf's cloak, and disturb the circle with your unlearned hand." The word prey struck like a slap, but Juliet kept her chin level, her gaze meeting the Hawkins' unwavering stare. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm, but she remembered Lucien's quiet command, "Stand." "I'm here because I didn't die when I should have," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her pulse. "I didn't choose to come here, but I'm trying to learn your ways. I'm trying to be more than what you see." The Hawkkin leader tilted his head, the bone circlet gleaming. "And what do we see?" Juliet took a breath, drawing strength from the memory of Lucien's unwavering presence. "You see weakness. Soft skin. Small bones. A thing easy to break. But you don't see that I'm still here, even after the circle tried to strip me down." A murmur ran through the gathered clans, a ripple of something akin to surprise. The Hawkins' black eyes narrowed, their depths unsettling. "Words cost little, human. You speak of standing, but you lean on the Wolf King's shadow. Without it, what are you?" Juliet hesitated, the question a knife edge designed to make her stumble and fall. But before she could answer, Lucien's voice cut through the air, low and resonant, drawing all attention back to him. "She is under my protection. That is all you need know." The Hawkkin leader smiled thinly, a subtle curving of his lips that held no warmth. "Protection can be revoked. Perhaps a better test is in order, one without your shadow to shield her." The Serpentkin elder stirred in his seat, his scales rustling softly. "Name your test, Hawk." The Hawkkin leader's smile deepened, though it never touched his cold, black eyes. "A hunt. At dawn." The murmurs turned to a low rumble of excitement, the anticipation palpable in the night air. Rhea's tail lashed once beside Juliet, and she whispered sharply, "Don't agree." But the Hawkkin leader's gaze was fixed on her now, sharp and unblinking. "What say you, human? Will you run, or will you prove you are more than prey?" The word hunt lodged in Juliet's chest like a splinter. Around the hollow, the air shifted, beastkin leaning forward, ears pricked, eyes bright with a primal curiosity. She could feel the hunger in it, the anticipation of spectacle. She glanced toward Lucien. His gaze was locked on the Hawkkin leader, gold meeting black in a silent, razor-sharp exchange that spoke volumes of contained fury. His hand flexed once at his side, claws glinting for the briefest of moments in the moonlight. "This is not your right to name," Lucien said, his voice low and dangerous, a growl barely contained. The Hawkkin leader tilted his head, feathers rustling with a dry, whispering sound. "It is the oldest right, Wolf King, the right to test the worth of those who claim a place in sacred lands. Or has the Northern Howl forgotten its own laws?" The Serpentkin elder's hood twitched. "The hawk speaks truth. If the human accepts, the trial is binding." Juliet's stomach turned with a knot of fear and a sudden, fierce surge of defiance. "If the human accepts." Lucien's eyes cut to hers at last. They burned, not with anger at her, but with a deep, urgent warning that resonated within the bond, a silent plea she could feel down to her bones. "You don't have to do this," he said, each word carved in stone, his voice a low, intimate murmur amidst the gathering storm. But she thought of the circle's eyes on her, the whispers in the village, the constant shadow of being kept rather than earned. If she refused, she'd confirm every suspicion that she was fragile, temporary, not worth the space she occupied. Her voice came quieter than she intended, a small sound against the vastness of the hollow, but it carried with a newfound resolve. What are the rules? The Hawkkin leader's smile sharpened, a predatory gleam in the darkness. At dawn, you will run from the hollow into the silverwood. You will carry no blade, no rune. Only your wits. You must reach the Stone of Three Echoes before the first moon sets. If you are caught, you lose. And if I win? A pause, the silence stretching taut. Then the Hawkkin will grant you leave to remain under the Wolf King's protection without further challenge from us. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. The terms were brutal, but final. Lucien stepped toward her, the subtle shift of his powerful body cutting her off from the Hawkkin's intense gaze. His voice was for her alone, a low caress of sound. This is not a test of skill. It's a test of survival, and they will not hold back. Juliet's heart pounded, fear warring with a flicker of fierce determination. Then I'll have to make them regret underestimating me. His jaw tightened, the muscle flexing beneath his skin. You are not ready. Then teach me before dawn. Something flickered in his eyes, anger, yes, but also something hotter, more dangerous, almost, pride. The Hawkkin leader spread his hands, a gesture of cold satisfaction. So it is agreed. The Serpentkin elder struck the butt of his staff against the stone, the sound echoing 3 times through the silent hollow. The trial is set. At dawn, the hunt begins. Lucien's voice followed them as the council began to rise, low and final, meant for Juliet's ears alone, a promise and a possessive claim woven together. If they lay a feather on you, I will break their wings. She didn't know if it was a promise, a threat, or both. But as the moons watched overhead, she realized there was no turning back. By dawn, she would either prove herself worthy of the Wolf King's world, or she wouldn't survive it at all. Chapter 17, The Hunt That Breathes. The village slept, but the den's training yard was alive with shadows and breath. Lucien circled her like a storm on 4 legs, his beast form massive and silent in the silvered moonlight. The air was thick with his scent, pine, frost, and something sharp as iron, and it kept her heart in her throat, a wild, fluttering thing. Again, he growled. Juliet darted to the left, trying to keep her steps light, but he was faster, always faster. His shoulder slammed into her, not enough to break her, but enough to send her sprawling in the dirt. Her palms stung. She pushed up, breath ragged. You're not, she gasped, teaching me how to run. You're teaching me how to lose. Lucien shifted back to his human form in a ripple of motion, hair falling loose from its cords. The Hawkkin are faster than you. Stronger than you. They see with the wind, hear your pulse from 100 paces. You cannot win by speed. Then how? He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. You make them chase you where you want them to go. You make them think they've cornered you. And when they commit, he caught her wrist suddenly, his grip gentle but firm, dragging her closer. You are already gone. Her pulse was wild against his fingers. Sounds simple. His mouth curved, humorless. It's not. And you have hours to learn. They ran the drills again. And again. Through shadows, over stone, ducking under low branches. Lucien taught her to break sightlines, to mask her trail with crushed herbs Rhea had brought, to listen for the change in wind that meant she was being flanked. More than once, his hand closed over her hip or shoulder, spinning her out of a path she thought was safe. Never trust open ground, he warned. If they can see you, they can kill you. Sweat soaked the collar of her tunic. Her lungs burned. But the ache felt different from the exhaustion she knew, less like defeat, more like something sharp being forged inside her. When she finally sagged against the low wall, Lucien crouched before her, his eyes bright with a strange, searching intensity. You are still too loud, he murmured. The forest will betray you before the Hawkkin even catch your scent. Juliet met his gaze, defiant despite the tremor in her arms. Then I'll have to be louder in ways they don't expect. For a heartbeat, he didn't answer. Then, unexpectedly, he pressed something into her palm. A small shard of obsidian, its edge napped fine as a razor. You'll carry it under your sleeve, he said. Not for the Hawkkin. For you. Juliet looked at the shard, then back to him. You think I'm going to need to cut my way out? I think, he said quietly, that the hawkkin have never hunted someone who refuses to be prey. And as the moons began to sink toward the horizon, Juliet realized they weren't just training her to survive the hunt, they were training her to turn it into something else entirely. Dawn bled slowly over their Therion, a pale gold that kissed the treetops but left the forest floor in shadow. The hollow was already crowded. Hawkkin lined the outer stones, their feathered cloaks rippling in the chill breeze, talons flexing against the earth. They were beautiful in the way predators often are, sleek, precise, and utterly merciless. Juliet stood alone at the center, the king's cloak gone, replaced with the dark, moon-thread tunic Rhea had given her. It felt lighter than air and twice as fragile. The hawkkin leader stepped forward, head tilting with the lazy confidence of a creature certain of the outcome. The stone of 3 echoes waits beyond the silverwood's heart. If you touch it before first moonset, the trial is yours. And if they catch me, she asked, her voice steady. His smile was thin. They will not kill you. But you will wish they had. Lucien's voice cut through the space like a blade. You will not harm her beyond the bounds of the trial. The hawkkin leader didn't even look at him. The hunt begins when the horn sounds. She will have 10 breaths lead. No more. Juliet's gaze found Lucien's across the hollow. He was standing at the edge of the circle, armored in shadow and steel, golden eyes locked on her with the unyielding focus of a predator refusing to look away from something he would kill to protect. He didn't move toward her. Didn't touch her. But she felt the words he didn't speak as surely as if they had been carved into her skin. Survive. The horn rose, a long, low note that curled through the trees like smoke. Juliet turned and ran. The silverwood swallowed her in 3 steps. Light fractured through silver leaves, dappling the ground in shifting patterns that made the path treacherous. She kept her pace measured, fast enough to seem urgent, slow enough to hear the forest breathing. Behind her, talons struck the earth. The sound was wrong, too many, too close. They were fanning out already. Lucien's voice from the night before whispered in her head, never trust open ground. She veered sharply left, sliding down a slope slick with moss, hands grabbing at roots for balance. She crushed a sprig of the bitter leaf Rhea had given her and smeared it against her skin, the sharp scent burning her nose but masking her human smell. The air changed. Softer. Still. Flanking, she realized. She cut between 2 leaning ash trees, slipping into a narrow game trail where the low branches would force the hawkkin to break stride. Her heart pounded against her ribs like it wanted to be free. A shadow crossed the ground ahead, wings. Juliet dropped flat, the rush of air from above cold against her neck. The hawk's cry pierced the morning, too close. They knew where she was. She rolled, came up on her feet, and ran not toward the heart of the forest, but toward a dense thicket where light barely touched the ground. Every step deeper made the air cooler, the silence heavier. Somewhere far behind, a voice called in the hawkkin tongue. It sounded almost amused. Juliet didn't let herself think about what that meant. She just ran, each stride carrying her farther into the shadowed lungs of the silverwood, where even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. The hunt had only just begun. Chapter 18, The Hunt That Breathes. The forest narrowed to a ribcage of black roots and silver leaves. Every sound was sharper here, the quick, percussive beat of her heart, the soft whisper of her breath against the cold air, the faint rustle of feathers where no wind stirred. They were close. Juliet slowed, letting her steps sink into the forest's rhythm. You make them chase you where you want them to go. Lucien's voice from the night before was steady in her mind, a deep, anchoring rumble that grounded her. You make them commit. She spotted the snarl of fallen branches ahead and angled toward it, slipping between the rotted limbs. Her fingers found the shard of obsidian he had given her, the edge pressing a quiet reassurance into her palm. A hawkkin shadow flickered to her left. She caught only the gleam of an eye before it vanished, moving parallel to her path. Good. She angled toward a patch of moonthread moss clinging to a low boulder. Kneeling quickly, she tore a strip from the hem of her tunic, rubbed it in the bitter leaf paste until the sharp scent stung her nose, then left it snagged in the moss. A false trail, strong enough to pull them wide. The cry came almost immediately. Sharp. Commanding. They'd found it. Juliet didn't run. She moved like water over stones, silent, deliberate, every step chosen. She curved around to the right, heading for the rise she'd memorized from Rhea's rough charcoal map. The Stone of Three Echoes would be visible from there, a pale tooth in the forest's jaw. But as she reached the base of the slope, the air shifted warmer, heavy with the musk of feathers and oil. She froze. Above her, perched on a branch that sagged under his weight, a hawkkin crouched. His feathers were the deep bronze of autumn, his eyes catching the light like molten coin. He tilted his head, studying her with the patient stillness of something deciding where to strike. "Run," he said in her tongue, his voice low and amused, a soft whisper of menace. Juliet's pulse thundered. Every muscle screamed to obey, but she forced her feet to remain still. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely carrying. His smile was all beak and hunger. "Because prey that doesn't run is no fun to catch." Juliet let the silence stretch, then, slowly, she stepped back, letting her heel crunch deliberately on a dry twig. The sound snapped through the air like a starting horn. The hawkkin launched. But she was already moving, diving sideways into the undergrowth. She didn't run blindly, she ran for the deadfall she'd seen earlier, the one choked with thorn and shadow. If he followed at speed, he'd have to fold his wings to fit. And in that squeeze, she could vanish. The obsidian shard burned cold in her palm. Juliet slid into the deadfall, the thorns clutching at her sleeves and hair. The hawkkin was right behind her, talons tearing at the earth, wings snapping shut to squeeze into the narrow choke of branches. He was fast, too fast. But speed meant nothing if you didn't see the trap. Juliet twisted sideways, letting the shadows of the bramble swallow her form. She pressed herself flat to the earth, her breaths measured, her heartbeat loud enough to feel in her throat. The hawkin's shadow passed overhead, wings scraping bark, his eyes fixed on where he thought she'd gone. "Now!" She rose in one sharp movement, the obsidian shard flashing in her grip. It wasn't enough to wound deeply, but she didn't need to. She slashed at the underside of his wing where feather met skin, exactly where Lucien had told her they were most sensitive. The hawkin's cry was a high, ripping sound, half pain, half anger. His wing snapped wide, catching in the tangled branches, and for a heartbeat he was pinned, thrashing. Juliet didn't wait to see if he freed himself. She bolted deeper into the silverwood, weaving between roots slick with moss, ducking under low-hanging limbs until her lungs burned. The forest blurred, silver and shadow, but she kept the slope in sight. Higher ground meant sightlines, meant choices. By the time she reached the crest, her legs felt carved from lead. She pressed her back against the trunk of a great ash, swallowing against the ache in her throat. Below, the hawkkin leader appeared, wings folding tight as he landed silently in the clearing. His gaze swept the forest, and though she was still, Juliet felt the weight of it pass over her. Then he smiled, slow, certain. "He knows I'm here." Juliet gripped the shard harder, the edge biting into her palm. She was no longer sure if the pounding in her chest was fear or something darker, sharper, a fierce resolve that had found a home there. The hunt was far from over, but for the first time since the horn had sounded, she realized she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and subscribe for more beautiful tales. Tap the next thumbnail to continue your journey.